try to trace a sort of overview of the general context in which Lucia Moholy operated. So I would like to start by some sort of random example. A few years ago, I was working on a photo book produced in Germany in 1930, Das Gesicht der Gegenwart. The author, Lothar Brigger, assembled around 70 photographic portraits taken from the illustrated press. Now, I'm starting by talking about this book because Brigger named the studio that realized the picture, providing us with a great source of names, dates, and location. So, putting it simply, if we open a random photo book published in Germany in 1930, who took the photos? Well, the answer will reveal a surprising preponderance of traditionally marginalized subjects. Of the 9 studios that did the plates, 4 were run by Jewish women, 6 founded by women and then taken over by their son, and 6 by Jewish in general. So this presence of these social categories in the photographic field in Germany at that period of time is quite hard to ignore. As Annette Winkel noted, although Jewish citizens made up less than 1% of the German population in 1925, we are talking 500,000 out of 63 million people, around 20 to 30% of the photojournalists in the 20s were Jewish. If then we move to forgotten names, so the name of people working in the labs, selling the equipment, working as retouchers or developers, this number will probably change again. Paradoxically, in this respect, the only data that can provide us some information about this vanished word come from the one responsible for its disappearance. So, for example, Michael Berkowitz estimated that of the 14,000 Jews who died in Mauthausen between 38 and 45, at least 400 were workers in the field of photography. Of course, there are socio-historical reasons behind that. First of all, photography struggled for decades to be understood not only as an art, but even as a respectable vocation. It was associated with people working for long hours in the dark, with hazardous chemicals. A great account of this is a short story by the Nobel Prize Israel Joshua Singer from 1919 in the Finster, in which the author recalls his own experience as a retoucher in the atelier of Alter Katzischer, and he talks about the smell of acids, the cold, the dust, the dark, everywhere, the oily air. And so we can quite understand why it wasn't such a big problem that the profession was left to a marginalized category. In addition, photography was a new medium without a long tradition of social barriers. So there was a guild system in Germany, but without any gender-specific or race-specific restriction. The studios were passed down in the family, so avoiding those practices of exclusion that a Jew would have faced in a public career. And also photography was linked to other career networks in which Jews established themselves, such as journalism, advertising, and fashion. In a way, the camera became a symbol of acculturation, assimilation, and longing for modernity, a practice of secular and modern Judaism that was still experienced with some scandal by the most conservative member of the communities. For example, there is this funny account by Friedrich Tieberger, who was the son of Frank's rabbi and the Hebrew teacher of Franz Kafka, and he recalls that Kafka was very uncomfortable when learning that his Hebrew teacher was an amateur photographer. Staunte darüber. Sie fotografieren, fragte, das ist doch eigentlich etwas Unheimliches. Und nach einer kurzen Pause, das vergrosten Sie noch. So, what I would like to argue here is that the processes that led women to turn to photography at the beginning of the century were similar to those that moved Jewish photographer. We can see them both as part of the transition of some social group from outsider to insiders that Peter Gay recognized as characteristic of the New Republic, and that led a group of marginalized identity finding a form of personal and professional fulfillment in photography. As for many Jews, this process was facilitated by infrastructures lacking in other fields. So, as you well know, in 1890 in Berlin, the Letterverein opened a photographische Lehranstalt for the education of women photographers. A similar institute opened in Breslau 1 year later, and in Munich in 1900 and 1905, at a time in which women were not admitted in art academy. They would have waited 1917 in Munich and 1919 in Berlin. In addition, the craft was, even in this case, passed down to daughters. For example, this is the first photograph ever taken by Lotte Jacobi. The photographer was 13 years old. She was taking a picture of her younger brother with the father observing her from the studio he had founded, his grandfather founded. We know that of the 430 photographic studios listed in Berlin in 1929, more than 30% were run by women. Of this world, we just have glimpses, but they are quite telling. For example, we know that Sigismund Jacobi here, by the 20s, had left a big part of the studio management to women. Lotte and her sister Ruth were working as photographers. Their mother, Mia, was responsible of the financial administration, and they hired Elisabeth Rothgers for marketing and archiving. Also, the captions that we find in the public press are often a great source, I believe, to understand the recognition of female professionals in the industry. So, for example, Joachim Gerstenberg's studio said that it was the Fuhr Dukop, reminding customer of the former owner, a woman, Brynja Dukop. Similarly, Ernst Foster kept the name Adele alongside his own, even many years after the death of the grandmother who founded the studio. And in many cases, Sasha and Camille Stone's atelier was listed simply as Camille Stone. This material and social circumstances, even if I don't have the space to talk about it right now, cannot be separated from aesthetic and ideological effects. So this woman, emancipated and entrepreneurial, not only embodied the Weimar Neue Frau, but also shaped it, contributed to its creation with their photograph for the illustrated press. Burkle and Attila Grossman mostly demonstrated the Jewish coded dimension of this visual culture, feminine visual culture from the 20s, especially in comparison to the Aryanized version that would characterize the following decade. Now, what's interesting is to observe how these two spaces, so the Jewish and the female photographic space, coexisted very much physically in the space of Berlin, and especially in the neighborhood of Kurfürstendamm. Between 1909 and 1910, the neighborhood Jewish population grew exponentially. In 1925, Grunewald was over 15% Jewish, we're talking some Charlottenburg, and Kudamm became one of the city's most important commercial centers, with store, theaters, art studio. Of course, the neighborhood stood for a cultivated Jewish modernity, and that wasn't great in the 30s, so the first prelude to the Kristallnacht happened in Kudamm in 1931, but in the 20s there was an unprecedented concentration of photo studios run by Jewish women. And it is important to consider this geographical factor because there was very much a network of collaboration and direct influences. For example, Ilse Siebert, who was the assistant of Steffi Brandl, recalls that the habit of Lotte Jacobi of exhibiting a picture in the studio window of the office or influenced all the young assistants working in the neighborhood that month by month were looking what was new. A great example, actually, for understanding the intertwining of geographical proximity, intellectual community, and distances of race and gender can be found in Marianne Breslauer memoir. Here, Breslauer recalled how a visit of an exhibition of the photographer Hannah Ries at the Gallery Flechtheim, mind you that both the atelier and the gallery were in Kudamm, was pivotal in her decision to start a career as a photographer. She goes on detailing the feminine nature of the craft, a Frauenberuf, and talking about the vibrancy of Berlin's photographic world with its zahllose atelier. What is interesting is the quick transition that Breslau does between remembering Anna Ries, the kleine jüdische Rotschopf, the small Jewish woman with red hair, to reflecting on the uncertainty of her fate, which is quite emblematic of the brevity and tragedy of this cultural season. So, of the author that I saw in the previous map, only Erna Landwehr-Dirksen, so the only non-Jewish woman, was able to keep her studio, becoming one of the leading photographers of National Socialism. Lotte Jacobi, Steffi Brandl, and Ellie Marcus migrated to the US. Eva was murdered in Sobibor, Charlotte Yoel in Auschwitz, Frida Ries in Paris. So, in the blink of an eye, this author, or rather the survivor among them, were pushed back to the margin of history, of geography, and of the canon. And it is difficult to look at this corpus all at once, because on one hand, a collective effort is needed to bring back all the names and biographies, an effort which has certainly begun, but is far from being completed. On the other, difficult methodological questions must be asked, and they will follow. So, okay, it is possible to look in the same way as those who managed to reopen a studio, those who worked sporadically with photography, those who found a network, those who remain isolated, those who migrated to the United States, those who stayed in Europe, those who moved to the future state of Israel or to non-Western country. Can tracing the path of individual exile produce a grammar? Or any attempt at a map would end in a territory in scale 101, like in Borges's famous short story. If the definition of exile usually refers to the idea of a lost homeland, we must also ask whether an autonomous paradigm might be needed for subjectivities such as the Jewish and the female, who can never fully relate to an idea of Heimat. However, recognizing that a visual culture emerged in the 20s that was both Jewish and female is a first step for further hermeneutic operation. And in this sense, we could try to understand exile as an analytical framework, a set of relationship between a constructed ideal of cultural unity as opposed to displacement, observing gaps and movement between pre- and post-exile offer, in other words, at the same time an archaeology of a vanished visual culture and an atlas of the transformation to which this original lexicon was subjected. For example, we can take into account how the state of exile often explored the modernist concept of high and low culture. We've already seen that. But the photographer who kept working with photography often had to take whatever photographic job they found. And so we need to navigate between reportage, microfilm, children's portrait, medical photography, and state commissions. Engaging with Weimar post-history forces the interpreter to go beyond the name that characterized the canon, but also the genres. It means looking at the plural legacy of a modernity that was born on the margin and rejected to the margin, but that existed and persisted off the radar of scholarly attention. It also means addressing the gaps and the silences, not only those of the actual victims, but also the voices that were structurally silenced by the patriarchal system, one of the very few structures that exile, in fact, did not seem to deconstruct. Ethel Mittag-Fodel, trained at Bauhaus, stopped taking photographs after the birth of her second child. Else Hausmann, owner of a studio in Hamburg, taught the craft and left the business entirely to her husband once in Cape Town. Marianne Breslauer gave up photography to work with her husband in the art gallery. Maria Eisner was fired from Magnum that she co-founded in 1951 because she was pregnant. And Robert Capa claimed, and I quote, that she would not be able to do her job properly once the child was born. Ellen Auerbach, who after her divorce could not provide financially for herself just with photography, and ultimately Lucia Moholy, whose theory and images were largely stolen from her, first by a patriarchal society, and then by an equally patriarchal scholarship. From this perspective, today's exhibition can be seen not only geographically, but above all culturally, as an act of historical and critical reparation, and as a homecoming. So thank you.